Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, good morning. My name is Sharfina Ghaisani Rulsyah from class 4B. Today, I want to review some textbook today. It's time to me to summarize the all 15 chapters in Modern American English 4. So let's get started. Okay, for chapter number 1 is the review of word order patterns of statement is at page 1. This chapter begins with reading and oral practice about New York City and California. In this chapter, there are 2 exercises. Then, this chapter is a review of word order patterns of statements, and the verb using is to be as linking verbs. So, for the exercise in this theory, there are 3 exercises. Then, there are few words for pronunciation in this chapter, and there are one exercise. The last is the evaluation for the chapter to make understanding of the word order. So, chapter number 2 is review of yes or no question and short answer form is at page 12. This chapter begins with reading and oral practice again about Saul's daily life, spent with his family and his work. And there are 2 exercises to answer the passage. And then there is a dialogue between Saul and his wife Bella. So for the dialogue exercise, there is 1 exercise, and then in this chapter 2, for the chapter 2, the theory is a review of how to make yes or no questions and how to make a short answer form. So in this chapter, there are practices to practice using yes or no questions and make a short answer form. And there are 3 exercises in this theory. At the end of chapter, there is a pronunciation practice again. So there is 1 exercise, and the evaluation there is 1 exercise. For the 3rd chapter is review negative statements and questions is at page 23. So this chapter begins with reading and oral practice again about Miguel's lives in Miami and how get to his works in this chapter. So there are 2 exercises in this reading and oral practice, and then in this chapter there is a review how to make negative statements and questions, and there is how to use no word for noun statements. And there are 3 exercises, and there is practice for this material. At the end of the chapter, there is a pronunciation practice. There is 1 exercise, and the general practice there is 1 exercise to understand the negative statements and no question. So for the chapter 4 is review question with question words is at page 34. So this chapter begins about Harika and Sandra in New York. So for this reading and oral practice, there are 2 exercises to answer the reading and oral practice, and there is dialogue between Harika and Sandra. So there is 1 exercise. So then in this chapter about review question with question words and how to use sentence word questions by using who, what, which, whose, and whom. And there is a practice to understand this theory. And there are 3 exercises in this chapter. So at the end of the chapter, there is a pronunciation practice again. So there is 1 exercise again, and then the little practice for understanding review question with question words. So there are 2 exercises. So for the chapter 5 is a review of all first 4 chapter. So in this chapter, everyone chapter already learned. There are a few practice to make the students understanding about this again. So at the end of the chapter, there is a practice how to making questions. Okay, for chapter 6 is about object clauses, indirect speech statements, and circumstances. Is at page 53. So, in this chapter begins with reading an oral practice about Tim who works as a firefighter and his daily life as a firefighter. And then there is question and answer to answer this reading and oral practice. And then at the end of the reading and oral practice, there is a dialogue between Nora and Tim when Tim is at hospital. For the theory, this is about object clauses, indirect and indirect speech. In this material is about how to use that in grammar rules. And there is an exercise. There are 3 exercises in this chapter to understanding object clauses and indirect speech for statements. And then in the end of the chapter, there is a pronunciation practice and general practice. And then for pronunciation practice, there is 1, and then general practice, there is 1 exercise. Chapter 7 is about indirect speech, yes-no question, and indirect speech question with words. It is at page 64. In this chapter begins with reading an oral practice about Althea Williams, who works as a teacher in one of the schools. And there is a question and answer for answering this reading and oral practice. And then there are 3 exercises. And the last is the dialogue practice between Althea and one of her students. And then in this chapter is about indirect speech for yes-no question and indirect speech for question with question words and rules using whether and if in grammar rules and using 5W plus 1H in indirect speech. And in this theory there are 3 exercises, and the end of the chapter there is a pronunciation practice. There is 1 exercise, and then general practice for understanding the chapter. So there is 1 exercise too. And then for chapter 8 is about indirect speech, indirect comments and requests, idiomatic for phrases like would like and so as a pronoun. Is at page 76. This chapter begins with reading an oral practice about Rulsyah Acevedo as a candidate in one of cities in America. So there is question and answer to answer this reading and oral practice. So there are 3 exercises in this chapter. And then in the end of the reading and oral practice, there is a dialogue practice between Jim and Rose at the city council office. And then for the theory is about indirect speech for comments and requests using would like for phrases and so in pronoun rules. And there is exercise for understanding theory. There are 3 exercises. For the information, would like is a formal word for want. At the end of the chapter, there is a pronunciation practice, there is 1 exercise, and general practice for understanding the chapter. So there is 1 exercise. Chapter 9 is about idiomatic verb phrases, be supposed to, used to, would rather, had better. Is at page 87. This chapter begins with reading an oral practice about Deborah Miller, who already rented a house in New York. And then there is a question and answer. There are 3 exercises to understanding the story. And then there is a practice between Drake and Deborah. Okay, for the theory is about idiomatic verbs, how to use being supposed to, used to, would rather, and have better in grammatical rules. And there is an exercise. There are 3 exercises. And the end of the chapter, there is a pronunciation practice. There is 1 exercise and general practice for understanding the chapter. There is 1 exercise. Okay, for the next is chapter 10 is review. Okay, in this chapter 10, this chapter same like chapter 5, but the materials are from chapter 6 to 9 with practice. There are 11 exercises with some, and then there is general practice. There are 2 general practice. Okay, next for chapter 11 is about conditions, future possible condition. It is at page 106. So this chapter begins with reading an oral practice about Joe Capelletti, who was in the construction industry. And then there is a question and answer to understand the story. So there are 3 exercises in this reading and oral practice. And then there is a dialogue between Joe and his family in the cafe. And then for the theory in this chapter is about conditions, future possible conditions, or we can call as if clause condition 1. And then in this theory there are 3 exercises in this practice to understanding if clause conditions. And then I will give some example. If they tear down these houses, they will build an office building here. And then for the exercise there are 3 exercises, and then there is a pronunciation practice. There is 1 exercise and general practice to understanding the chapter. Okay, for the chapter 12 is about conditions contrary to fact, present condition, and the pronoun others. This chapter begins with reading an oral practice about Lenny Legg's life, who finds his job. There is question and answer for understanding this story, and there are 3 exercises for this reading and oral practice. And there is dialogue between Billy and Lenny when Lenny wants to find a job. So there is 1 exercise. Okay, for the theory is about conditions contrary to fact, present conditions, and or we can call as if clause condition 2. And then for the for the example, if he lives in suburbs, he will have to drive to work. And then for the exercise, there are 3 exercises, and then there is a pronunciation practice and general practice to understanding this chapter. Okay, for the chapter 13 is about conditions contrary to fact, past conditions is at page 129. Okay, in this chapter begins with reading and oral practice again about Graciela Rivera, who works in garment industry. There is a question and answer for understanding the story. There are 3 exercises, and there is a dialogue practice between Graciela and Pedro for dialogue practice. There is 1 exercise. And then for a theory in this chapter is about conditions contrary to fact, past conditions, or we can call as if clause condition 3. Okay, for the example, if they would fire him, he could have collected unemployment pay. So this is the example for if clause 3. And then for the exercise, there are 3 exercises in this chapter. And then there is a pronunciation practice and general practice to understanding this chapter. Okay, for chapter 14 is about causal verbs, how to use have, get, make. Is at page 141. In this chapter begins with reading an oral practice about Thomas Chang, who is an American Chinese person who lives in America. And then there is a question and answer to answer this reading and oral practice. And then there is a dialogue between Sylvia and Thomas for dialogue practice. So there for the reading and oral practice there are 3 exercises, and then for dialogue there is 1 exercise. And then for the chapter for the theory is about causal verbs, how to use have, get, make in grammatical rules. And then for the example for this, he got his car fixed. And this is for how to use have or get, or you want to use have or make, you can use I will make him check the figures himself. So this is the example. And then for the exercise, there are 4 exercises in this chapter. And then there are pronunciation practice again. There is 1 exercise, and then general practice 1 exercise. And the last page, chapter 15 is about review. Is at page 152. In this chapter, there are 12 exercises for each chapter from chapter 11 to chapter 14. And then there is a general practice. There are 1 exercise. Okay everyone, are you already heard about the textbook I reviewed that? And thank you so much to listen and hear. And nun, welcome Mama Yasturun, fastabikul khairat. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you